She was 19 years old and she had exactly $12 to her name. 12 crumpled bills folded so many times, the creases had gone soft as cloth pressed deep into the pocket of a dress that no longer fit her properly. In her other hand, she carried a small canvas bag containing one change of clothes, a bar of lye soap, her mother's worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, and a carving knife with a handle of polished apple wood. The only thing in this world that had ever been given to her because someone believed she deserved it. Her father had locked the door behind her at dawn. Her stepmother had pinned the note to her bag herself. Do not return. It would be an inconvenience. And so Maren Whitfield walked west 4 days through the cold Appalachian foothills of West Virginia until she stood at the mouth of a valley that the locals would not enter after sundown. They called the place Hollow Creek. They called the cabin at the end of the trail Cursed, a stone house where a child had died, where a man had been crushed in a mine that everyone swore was no accident, where a widow had vanished into thin air 12 years before and was never seen again. The price of that cursed cabin, the land agent told her, was $12. Exactly $12. She laid every bill on the counter without blinking. What Maren did not yet know, what no one in that valley had dared to remember out loud in over a decade, was that beneath the cracked hearthstone of her new home lay a bundle of oilskin, a letter written in a dying woman's hand, and a secret that would call down justice on the most powerful man in 3 counties. If you believe some places remember the people who loved them, and some people are born to finish what others could not, stay with me. This is the story of the $12 cabin. The morning Maren Whitfield was put out of her father's house, the sky over Mill Hollow, West Virginia, was the color of old pewter, and the first frost of the season lay thin and silver on the brown October grass. She was 19 years old. She did not yet know it would be the last sunrise she would ever see from that porch. The house she had been born in stood at the eastern edge of town, where the cobbled street gave way to a dirt lane that wound down toward the sawmill. It was a narrow 2-story house painted white once, but gone gray in the weather, with a tin roof that pinged in the rain and a small front garden where her mother had once grown bee balm and yellow coneflower. The garden was dead now. It had been dead for more than 10 years. Prudence Vance, the woman who had married Maren's father a year after the fever, took her mother, did not believe in flowers. She believed in onions, in turnips, in cabbages that could be pickled and stored in the cellar. She believed in things that could be counted, weighed, and made to last through a hard winter. She did not believe in Maren. The girl was in Prudence's estimation an extravagance her father could no longer afford. That morning, when Maren came down the back stairs with her shoes in her hand to avoid waking the house, she found that the kitchen door was bolted from the inside, and the bolt had been driven home with a small finishing nail to keep her from sliding it open. She stood very still in the cold dark of the stair landing and listened. She could hear her stepmother moving about in the parlor, the soft swish of a broom on bare floorboards. She could hear the slow scrape of her father's pen in his ledger. He was already awake. He was awake, and he had said nothing. She walked back upstairs in her stocking feet, pulled on her shoes in her little bedroom under the eaves, and looked out the small window at the dawn coming up over the ridge. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying changed nothing in this house. Crying did not bring back her mother. Crying did not soften her stepmother. Crying did not make her father look up from his ledger. She gathered her things into a small canvas bag. There was not much to gather. One change of clothes, a brown wool dress with a patched elbow and a clean white pinafore that her mother had sewn for her the year before she died. A bar of yellow lye soap wrapped in brown paper. A worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress that her mother had read aloud to her on winter evenings, the leather binding cracked and the gilt worn off the spine. A small tin comb, 3 hairpins, a linen handkerchief embroidered in one corner with the letters E.W. Elspeth Whitfield, her mother's initials, in her mother's own hand. That was all. She came down the stairs again with the bag over her shoulder, and this time she went out the front door. It opened without resistance. Of course it did. The bolt had only ever been on the kitchen door, the door she always used. The front door had not been intended to keep her in. It had been intended to put her out. She understood this immediately, the way a person understands the weather by stepping outside. On the front porch sat a smaller bag, identical to the one already on her shoulder. Pinned to its cloth handle was a folded sheet of writing paper. She knew the handwriting before she opened it. The narrow, slanted script of her stepmother, every letter sharp and economical, as though even the ink on the page could not be wasted. Marin, you are 19 now, a woman grown. You have been more than provided for. The time has come for you to make your own way. Your father and I have done our Christian duty by you, and we wish you well, but you are not to return to this house. It would cause us inconvenience and embarrassment. There is $12 in the bag. That is more than you deserve and more than we owe. Prudence Vance Whitfield. There was no signature from her father. There was, however, something else in the second bag, something that had not been there when Prudence packed it. Wrapped in a clean square of muslin, tucked carefully beneath the folded coins, lay the carving knife. The applewood handle dark with years of linseed oil and the warmth of her own palm. The blade of fine Swedish steel that her teacher, Wendell Carver, had hammered out for her on her 16th birthday and slipped into her hand without a word. She had not put the knife in the bag. Her stepmother would never have included it. Prudence would have sold it for the steel. It had been her father. Somewhere in the long hours of the night, while she slept under the eaves, and Prudence slept in the bedroom that had once been her mother's, her father, Caleb Whitfield, had come down to the kitchen, opened the drawer where she kept the knife, and slipped it into the bag himself. and beneath the knife, on a torn scrap of brown wrapping paper, he had written in his small, careful hand 2 words: Hollow Creek. That was all. No apology, no farewell, no explanation. Just those 2 words in the only handwriting in the world she had ever loved. Marin Whitfield stood on the porch of the house she had been born in the cold October air, burning in her lungs, and she did not cry. She folded the note. She folded the scrap of brown paper. She put them both in the deep pocket of her dress next to the $12. She shouldered both canvas bags. She walked down the porch steps and out onto the dirt lane. She did not look back at the window where her father sat with his ledger. She did not need to. She already knew he would not be looking up. To understand why a young woman could walk away from her father's house on a cold October morning without breaking you must understand the 8 years that came before it. Marin Whitfield had been 8 years old the autumn her mother died. Elspeth Whitfield had been a midwife, not the only one in Mill Hollow, but the one the women asked for when a labor went hard, when a child came turned the wrong way, when a young wife was bleeding and frightened, and the doctor was 3 towns over and would not arrive in time. Elspeth had small, steady hands and a low, calm voice, and she had been known in the 4 counties around Mill Hollow as the woman who could be relied on at the worst hour of the worst night. She kept a leather satchel by the door, packed and ready, and when the knock came, she would lean over Marin's little iron bed and kiss her forehead and whisper, "Be brave for me, little one. I'll be back by morning." And she always was. Until the morning she was not. It was not childbirth that took her. It was typhoid carried into the valley that fall by a peddler who had come down with it on the road and not known. Elspeth caught the fever from a young mother she was attending. She was dead in 9 days. Caleb Whitfield, who had loved his wife with the quiet, desperate love of a shy man who had never expected to be loved in return, sat in the parlor for 3 days after the funeral without speaking. On the 4th day, he opened his ledger and began to write down the household expenses, and he did not stop writing them down for the rest of his life. He was a clerk for the Cumberland Lumber Company, a bookkeeper, a man of small, neat columns and balanced sums. He had served as a young man in the last hard year of the war between the states, had ridden out of West Virginia in the spring of 1865 with the 8th Mounted Infantry, and come home in the autumn with a limp in his left leg and a silence in him that nobody could quite name. Elspeth had been the only person he had ever told about the things he had seen at the burning of the Shenandoah barns. After she died, he never spoke of any of it again. A year after the funeral, the women of the church began to whisper that a man with a young daughter could not go on alone, and they presented him with a list of suitable widows. Caleb Whitfield, who could not bear to choose, allowed himself to be chosen. The woman who chose him was Prudence Vance, a tall, thin widow from over in Ashe County, whose first husband had been a deacon and whose brother was a preacher of considerable local reputation, the Reverend Ezekiel Vance. Prudence came with a small inheritance, a great quantity of starched linen, and the firm conviction that a household must run on principle and not on sentiment. She did not strike Marin. She did not raise her voice. She did not in any way that could be pointed to mistreat the child. She simply did not warm to her. She set out 3 meals a day on the table, mended the girls' stockings when they tore, sent her to the schoolhouse with a clean pinafore, and otherwise treated her as one might treat a boarder who had paid the rent in advance, but whose company one did not particularly enjoy. For Caleb, who had folded himself away inside his ledger, this seemed acceptable. For Marin, who had been the daughter of a midwife with small, steady hands and a low, calm voice, it was a kind of slow starving. She might have starved entirely if not for Wendell Carver. Wendell Carver was a carpenter. His shop stood at the end of the dirt lane just past the lumber yard in a long, low building of weathered cedar that smelled even from the road of pine shavings and linseed oil and the sharp, clean scent of freshly cut oak. He was 70 years old. His hands were as broad and gnarled as the roots of an old apple tree, and there was always a faint, dark stain of wood pitch in the creases of his knuckles. He had been a soldier once. He had ridden out of West Virginia in 1861 with the same regiment Caleb Whitfield would later join, and he had come home in 1865 with a wife and 1 son, a fine tall boy of 7 named Asa. The wife had died of a cough in 1872. Asa had grown into a tall, quiet young man with his father's hands, and in the spring of 1898, he had marched off to a small war in a place called Cuba, and he had not come home. After that, Wendell Carver did not speak much. He worked. He took commissions for tables and chairs and coffins. He repaired the wagon wheels and the church pews and the wooden gutters on the schoolhouse roof. And on the warm summer evening when Marin Whitfield, 11 years old and lonelier than any child has the right to be, came and stood at the open door of his shop and watched him work, he did not send her away. He did not invite her in either. He simply, after about an hour, walked over to a stump near the door, set a small block of soft white pine on it, set a small carving knife beside it, and went back to his bench. Marin picked up the knife. She did not put it down again for 8 years. He taught her over those 8 years almost everything he knew. He taught her how to read the grain of a piece of oak by laying her palm flat against it and closing her eyes. He taught her how to test the edge of a chisel against the soft pad of her thumb and know, without drawing blood, whether it would cut clean. He taught her the song of a handsaw biting into maple and the different, deeper song it sang in pine. He taught her to mix lime mortar by feel, the way a woman mixes biscuit dough, until it clung to the trowel in just the right thick curl. He taught her to lay a foundation stone so that it would still be standing 100 years after her bones were in the ground. He taught her how to load and fire a hunting rifle and how to keep it clean and where to aim on a deer so that the animal would drop where it stood and not suffer. He did not praise her. He almost never praised anyone. When she cut her first true dovetail joint, the pins fitting the tails so cleanly that no light showed through the seam, he ran his thick, stained finger over the joint once, and he nodded once, and he said, "That'll do." That single nod was the most precious thing she had ever received from any living person except for her mother. On her 16th birthday, he gave her the knife. He gave it to her without ceremony. She came into the shop on a wet March morning, hung up her shawl on the nail by the door, and walked over to the bench. There was a small leather sheath lying on top of her usual work apron. She picked it up. She slid out the blade. The steel was bright and fine. The handle was applewood from the tree in his own yard, the wood worn dark and smooth from 100 hours of his own shaping. It fit her hand the way her mother's voice had fit her name. She looked up at him. He was not looking at her. He was bent over the leg of a Windsor chair, working with the draw knife. The hand that uses it, he said, without turning around. That one was made for yours. She wore it on her hip every day after that. In a small leather sheath she stitched herself hidden under the long apron she wore in the shop. It was the only thing of value she owned in the world. And on the morning her father slid it into the canvas bag on the front porch, she understood that somewhere deep in the locked and silent place where he had buried himself, Caleb Whitfield still loved his daughter. He just no longer knew how to say so out loud. There was a reason Prudence Vance had chosen that particular October morning to put Marin out of the house. The reason had nothing to do with Marin being 19. The reason had to do with a piece of paper. Elspeth Whitfield had owned in her own name 40 acres of standing timber up on Sutton Ridge. The land had come to her from her father, a small farmer who had cleared it himself in the years before the war. When Elspeth died, the deed had been folded into the Bible on her bedside table, with a note in her own hand written across the inside cover. To be held in trust for our daughter, Marin, to come into her hand on the day she turns 21. Prudence had found the deed within a month of moving into the house. She had not destroyed it. Prudence was a careful woman, not a reckless one. She had simply put it away in the locked walnut box where she kept the household papers, and she had said nothing about it for 10 years. But the Cumberland Lumber Company had begun that summer of 1908 to send agents up into the high ridges. They were buying timber rights. They were paying by the standards of Mill Hollow an astonishing price. 40 acres of standing oak and walnut on Sutton Ridge would fetch, Prudence had calculated in her own small private ledger, just under $900. $900 was a sum that could lift the Whitfield household out of the cramped white house at the edge of town and set it down in one of the brick houses on Main Street. $900 was a sum that could buy a piano. $900 was a sum that, in Prudence's careful estimation, ought not to be wasted on a stepdaughter who would only marry some carpenter's apprentice and have it spent on her by spring. The trouble was that the deed was not in Prudence's name. The deed was in Elspeth's name, with a clear written instruction that it passed to Maren on her 21st birthday. And Maren's 21st birthday was a year and a half away. Prudence had taken the matter to her brother, the Reverend Ezekiel Vance, in early September. The Reverend was a tall, stooped man with a smooth, oiled beard and a way of holding his hands clasped in front of his black coat that made him look perpetually about to deliver a benediction. He had read the deed twice, frowning over his small steel spectacles. And he had said, after a long, thoughtful silence, that there was a way. Caleb is the legal guardian until the girl is 21, the Reverend had said softly. If the girl is shown to be of bad character, if, say, she were proven a thief and were turned out of the household before her majority, then guardianship reverts and the trust dissolves. The land passes to Caleb. And what passes to Caleb, he added, looking at his sister with his small, mild eyes, passes also to his lawful wife. Prudence had nodded slowly. A week later, the silver communion service of the First Methodist Church of Mill Hollow had gone missing from the locked vestry cabinet, and the only person besides the Reverend who had a key to that cabinet, a key Prudence herself had pressed into wax and had a copy made of 3 years before, was the sexton's wife, who was 80 and half blind. The silver service had been found 3 days later, wrapped in burlap, hidden in the rafters above Maren Whitfield's small bedroom under the eaves. Maren had not put it there. She had not even known it was missing. But the Reverend had stood in the parlor with his hands clasped in front of his black coat, and he had looked at Caleb Whitfield with his small, mild eyes, and he had said in his soft preacher's voice that the matter need not become a public scandal, that the church would not press charges out of respect for the family, that it was enough, the Reverend said, that the girl be put quietly out of the household. For the good of her soul, he said, and the peace of the congregation. Caleb had not looked at his daughter. He had not asked her if she had taken the silver. He had sat at the dining table with his ledger open in front of him, and he had stared down at the columns of numbers as though they were a frozen river, and he had not said one word. That night, after Prudence had gone to bed, he had come down the stairs in his stocking feet. He had opened the kitchen drawer where Maren kept her knife. He had wrapped the knife in a square of muslin. He had carried it out to the front porch and laid it in the canvas bag that his wife had packed. He had taken a scrap of brown wrapping paper from the kitchen. He had written 2 words on it, Hollow Creek. Then he had gone back upstairs, and he had lain down in the bedroom that had once been his wife Elspeth's, beside a woman who was about to steal his daughter's birthright, and he had not slept for the rest of the night. In the morning, when Maren walked out of the house, he sat at his dining table with his back to the window, and he stared down at his ledger and he did not turn around. He could not. If he had turned around, he would have had to see what kind of man he had become. Marin Whitfield walked west. She walked west because the only place in the world she knew to go was the place written on the scrap of brown paper in her pocket. Hollow Creek. She had heard the name once or twice in the carpenter shop. Wendell Carver had spoken it on a winter afternoon 3 years before when they were planning the long boards of a coffin lid. He had said it almost to himself, his eyes far away. Best stonework I ever helped lay was up in Hollow Creek, he had said. Long time ago. Long time. She had not asked him what he meant. You did not ask Wendell Carver to explain himself. But she had remembered the name, and now the name was in her pocket, in her father's own hand. She walked the first day along the wagon road that ran west out of Mill Hollow, past the lumber yard, past the sawmill, past the place where the road forked, and the right-hand fork bore the wooden sign that pointed toward Charleston. She took the left-hand fork. It was the smaller road, the older road, and it led up into the foothills of the Allegheny country, into the high green folds of the land where the farms grew smaller and the houses farther apart. She slept that first night in a hay barn burrowed deep into the loose straw with the carving knife unsheathed and laid across her chest under the canvas bag. She did not sleep much. The frost cracked in the timbers above her. An owl called twice from the woods beyond the barn. She thought about her mother. She thought about Wendell Carver's hands. She did not think about her father. She had put her father away inside a small, locked room in her mind, the way he had put her mother away inside his ledger, and she did not intend to open the door of that room any time soon. The second day, she walked through long stretches of stubble field where the corn had been cut. She passed a farm where a woman was scattering grain to a flock of chickens, and the woman straightened up and watched her go by, and after a moment the woman called out and ran inside and came back with a heel of brown bread and a wedge of hard yellow cheese wrapped in a piece of waxed cloth. The woman pressed it into Marin's hand without a word and squeezed her wrist once hard and then turned and went back to her chickens. Marin ate the bread and cheese sitting on a flat rock by the road that afternoon, and she wept for the first and only time on her journey, not for what she had lost, but for the kindness of a stranger who had seen her and known. The third day, the road climbed. The fields gave way to forest. The air thinned and sharpened. The smell of wood smoke from distant cabins drifted across the trail. She passed 3 travelers that day, a tinker with a cart full of pots, a young man on a mule who tipped his hat to her without speaking, and an old woman walking with a basket of eggs who told her that there was a spring half a mile up the road where the water was sweet and would not give her the runs. Marin thanked her and walked on. The 4th day was the hardest. The road had become a track. The track climbed steeply through a notch in the ridge between 2 outcroppings of pale gray rock that rose like the gateposts of some older world. The forest closed in. The light grew dim and green. She did not see another human being all morning. In the early afternoon, she stopped at a small stream to fill her tin cup and to soak her bread. And as she knelt by the water, she heard behind her the soft crunch of a boot on gravel. She turned slowly. The man standing on the path was perhaps 30 years old. He had a thin, sharp face under a battered hat and a beard that had not been trimmed in some time, and his coat was the kind of coat that men wear when they have been sleeping in it for weeks. There was a small canvas pack on his back and a pickaxe slung through the straps, and he was looking at her in a way she had seen twice before in her life, in the eyes of men who had been drinking. He was a placer miner, a man who panned the streams of the high country for the flecks of gold that sometimes came down from the upper ridges. There were a great many such men in those years, drifting through the Appalachian valleys, harmless, mostly, but not always. Far from home, miss, the man said. His voice was soft, and the softness in it was not kindness. I'm not far from home, Marin said. I'm close to it. She stood up slowly from the stream. She did not break his eyes with hers. She slid her right hand down along the line of her hip under the fold of her long apron, and her fingers closed around the smooth applewood handle of the knife. The man took a step toward her. That's an awful pretty bag, he said softly. Awful pretty for a girl alone. He took another step. She drew the knife. She did not raise it. She did not threaten with it. She simply held it down along the line of her thigh, the bright, fine steel of the blade catching the green light under the trees. And she looked at him, and she said, in a voice as quiet and steady as her mother's had been on the worst nights of the worst labors. Mister, I have walked 4 days. I am tired. I am not afraid of you. If you come one more step, I will open you from your belt to your throat, and I will leave you in this stream, and the crows will have your eyes by morning. She did not blink. She did not raise her voice. She had been taught by a man who had ridden out of West Virginia in 1861 and had seen things in the burning Shenandoah that he had never told even his wife exactly how to hold a knife so that the person looking at it understood that you knew how to use it. The miner looked at the knife. He looked at her face. He looked at the knife again. He took one slow step backward, then another. Then he turned without a word and walked away up the path the way she had come, and he did not look back. She stood by the stream for a long time after he was gone, with the knife still down along her thigh, and her heart beat very slowly and very evenly, and she discovered with a kind of cold, clear wonder that she was not shaking. She was not afraid. She slid the knife back into the sheath at her hip. She picked up her bag. She walked on. She crested the high ridge at sunset. The valley of Hollow Creek opened below her like a long green bowl held in the cupped hands of two mountains. A silver thread of water wound through the bottom of it. A handful of small lights, no more than 5 or 6, twinkled near the lower end, where a wagon road came up out of the south. The peaks above were already in shadow, but the higher slopes still held the last of the light, and the sky above them was the deep, clean blue of a winter evening, with one early star burning just above the eastern ridge. She stood on the high ridge for a long time and looked down at the valley. She did not know that within an hour she would walk into the small settlement at the lower end of it and meet a man who would go pale at the sight of her father's gift on her hip. She did not know that within a week she would lift a cracked granite hearthstone in an abandoned cabin and find beneath it a bundle of oilskin and a letter from a dead woman. She did not know that within a month, a man named Cyrus Holloway, who owned the silver mine on the far ridge and who lived in a brick house with 8 chimneys in the county seat, would learn her name and decide in the cool, calm way that men of that kind decide such things, that she would have to be removed. She knew only what she could see. She could see the valley. She could see the lights. She could see a place where the smoke rose straight up out of a chimney into the still, cold air, the way smoke rises only on the evenings when the weather has decided, after a long, warm autumn, that it is finally time for winter. She adjusted the strap of the canvas bag on her shoulder. She started down the long path into the valley. The settlement at the mouth of Hollow Creek was barely worth the name. There was a small general store with a wooden porch and a single hitching rail, and beside it, a blacksmith's forge, whose fire had gone out for the day, and beyond those scattered up the slope and along the creek, perhaps a dozen small frame houses with cedar shake roofs. A church stood on the far side of the creek, a plain white building with no steeple, only a wooden cross above the door. A wagon road came up from the south, crossed a small wooden bridge over the creek, and ended at the porch of the general store, as though the road itself had walked 4 days to get here and was now lying down to rest. The light was almost gone when Marin came down off the ridge trail. A single yellow lamp burned in the front window of the store. She crossed the wooden bridge. The creek ran fast beneath it, dark and silver in the dusk. She walked up the 3 plank steps of the porch and pushed open the door of the store, and a small brass bell over the door rang once softly in the quiet. The man behind the counter looked up. He was tall and very thin, perhaps 65 years old, with white hair cropped close to a long, narrow skull, and a face that had been carved by weather and by something else. Some old, quiet sorrow that had set into the lines around his eyes, the way frost sets into stone. He wore a brown wool vest over a clean white shirt, and the cuffs of the shirt were rolled neatly back to the elbow and on the back of his left hand, just above the wrist. There was a small, old, puckered scar in the shape of a star of the kind that men come back from wars with and do not explain. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in a low, careful voice. "You've come a long way, miss." 4 days, Marin said. "And on foot," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. He looked her up and down once, taking in the worn dress, and the canvas bags, and the dust of the road on her boots, and his eyes moved to her face and held there. "You'll want supper," he said, "and a place to put your head tonight. My wife keeps a small back room. It's clean. We charge nothing for travelers who come in after dark." "That's kind of you, sir." "It isn't kindness," he said. "It's how things are done up here." He came around from behind the counter. He moved slowly the way a man moves who has been on his feet all day, and he gestured her toward the small iron stove at the back of the store, where a kettle sat on the warm plate. He poured her a tin cup of dark coffee and set out a small dish of cornbread and a square of cold ham, and he watched her while she ate. Not staring, just present the way a careful man watches a horse he has just bought and is trying to read. When she had eaten, she set down the tin cup and folded her hands on the counter and said, "I was told there might be land for sale up this valley. A cabin, maybe. Something a person could fix up." He was silent for a long moment. "Who told you that?" he asked gently. "No one." She said, "I'm asking." He nodded once. He went back behind the counter. He bent down and lifted up from beneath it a large leather-bound book, the cover stamped in faded gold with the words, "Hollow Creek Lands, Record of Deeds." He set the book on the counter. He opened it. He turned 3 pages slowly with one long, careful finger. "There is one place," he said, "just one. 5 acres, stone cabin, sits a mile up the creek in a clearing under a stand of ponderosa pine. Been empty more than 10 years. The county will sell the deed for $12 to clear it off the rolls." He paused. He looked up at her over the book. "Folks call it the Cursed Cabin, miss," he said. "I won't lie to you. The family that built it lost everything inside its walls. The little boy went first in the winter of '92. The father, a year after that, killed in a fall of rock at the Holloway silver mine on the far ridge. The mother held on alone for 3 years, and then one morning in the autumn of '96, she packed a small bag and walked down out of this valley and was never seen again. Not by anyone in Hollow Creek. Not by anyone anywhere, so far as is known." $12, Marin said quietly. $12, he said. She unfolded her hand from the pocket of her dress. She laid the bills out on the counter, one by one, smoothing each one with her palm. 12 worn dollars, the same 12 her stepmother had counted into the canvas bag the night before every cent she had in the world. The old man behind the counter looked down at the money. Then he looked up at her, and as he looked up, his eyes traveled down for the first time to her right hip where the leather sheath rode at her belt under the long apron, and where the dark applewood handle of the carving knife stood up out of the sheath, polished to the deep, soft shine of an oil-rubbed thing that has been held by the same hand for many years. The old man went very still The color drained slowly out of his weathered face. He reached out one trembling hand, not to touch the knife, but as though to steady himself on the counter, and he stared at the applewood handle, the way a man might stare at the face of a person he had buried 30 years before, where he said, and his voice had gone soft and thin, "Where did you get that knife?" "A man gave it to me," Marin said. "A carpenter in Mill Hollow. He made it for me on my 16th birthday." "A carpenter," the old man whispered. "Yes, sir. What was his name?" "Wendell," she said. "Wendell Carver." The old man closed his eyes. He stood for a long moment with his eyes closed and his hand braced on the counter, and his lips moved as though he were speaking words to himself, words she could not hear. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. He looked at her. He looked at her, this 19-year-old girl with the dust of 4 days walking on her boots. This girl who had come down out of the high ridge at sunset with $12 in her pocket and a knife on her hip. And he said in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward to catch it, "Child, you did not come to this valley by accident." She did not know what to say to that. She did not know what he meant. She said only, "Sir, may I have the deed?" He looked down at the $12 on the counter. He looked back at her. He swept the bills into his palm slowly, almost reverently, and he opened the leather book and took up his pen, and in a hand that was no longer entirely steady, the old man whose name she did not yet know, Silas Thornberry, who had himself ridden out of West Virginia in 1861, and who had not laid eyes on the applewood-handled work of Wendell Carver in more than 40 years, wrote her name across the top of the page. Marin Whitfield, he wrote, "Of Hollow Creek, this 23rd day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1898. He blew gently on the ink to dry it. He turned the book around and slid it across the counter to her. She signed her name beneath his, the first time in her life that she had ever signed her name to a deed of property. The cabin lay a mile up the creek. Silas Thornberry walked the first half of that mile with her in the last of the blue dusk, carrying a lantern and saying almost nothing. The path followed the water. The water made a low, cold music over the stones. The pines stood tall and black on either side, and the cold, sharp air smelled of needles and of the coming winter. Once halfway along the path, the old man stopped and turned to her and said softly, "You'll find the door hanging off a hinge. Mind your step on the stone of the threshold. It's worn slick." And then after a long pause, he added, "There are some things in that house, child, that have been waiting on someone for a long time. I do not know what they are. I only know they have been waiting." He left her at the edge of the small clearing. He set the lantern down on a flat rock at the head of the path. "Take it," he said. "Bring it back tomorrow or the day after, whenever you have a candle of your own." He turned and he walked back down the creek path, and his lantern was already gone, and she was alone in the clearing with only the cold rising moon for light. She stood for a long time looking at the cabin. It was smaller than she had imagined and larger than she had hoped. The foundation and the lower walls were of fitted river stone, dark gray in the moonlight. Every stone set with the patient skill of a man who knew his trade. The upper walls were of square, notched logs, weathered to the soft silver of long dead wood. The sod roof was a thick mat of dead autumn grass, and a single wildflower stalk stood up out of the ridge against the moon. One window was a black square of broken glass. The heavy plank door hung crooked, held by a single rotted leather hinge, and it gaped slightly open like a tired mouth. She walked across the clearing. She pushed the door slowly with the flat of her palm. It groaned on the broken hinge and swung inward. She lifted the lantern and stepped over the worn stone threshold. The air inside was very cold and very still, and it smelled of dust and of long dead ashes and of the faint sweet ghost of cured wood. She lifted the lantern higher. The single room of the cabin opened around her in the swaying yellow light. A great stone hearth at the back wall, its hearthstone cracked clean across the middle and settled crookedly into its bed. A few scattered pieces of broken pottery on the floor. The remains of a wooden table fallen to one side. A narrow wooden ladder leading up to a small sleeping loft above. She walked slowly into the room. She held the lantern out before her. The yellow light climbed up the wall. It climbed up past the broken table, past the dark stones of the hearth, past the lower courses of the silvered logs, until it reached the great square-hewn ridge beam that ran the length of the cabin and held up the roof. And there, carved into the soft pale wood of the underside of that beam, exactly in the center, where a man working alone with a chisel would have stood to make his mark, she saw a small, clean, perfect symbol. 2 letters intertwined, a W and a C. The maker's mark of Wendell Carver. The very mark he had taught her 3 winters before to cut into the back of every chair she finished in his shop. Marin Whitfield stood alone in the cold and the moonlight in a cabin she had bought 1 hour before, with the last $12 in the world, in a valley she had never set foot in until that afternoon. And she lifted the lantern and looked up at the mark of her teacher's own hand, cut into the beam above her head 25 years before she was born. And she understood with a slow, cold certainty that rose in her chest, like the slow, cold light of a winter dawn, that everything she thought she knew about her life had been only the smallest visible piece of a much larger and much older story. The cabin had been waiting for her. The old man at the store had known. And Wendell Carver, who had set a block of pine and a small knife on a stump one summer evening 8 years before and gone back to his work without a word, Wendell Carver had known too. She lowered the lantern slowly. She stood in the dark cabin of the dead family Ashford in the valley of Hollow Creek. in the great cold silence of the West Virginia mountains. And for the first time since she had walked off her father's porch that morning, she felt the small, hot prick of tears in her eyes. They were not tears of grief. They were tears of a person who has been told after a long, long time of believing herself unwanted in the world that she was, in fact, expected. The first morning, Maren Whitfield woke inside the cabin of the dead family Ashford. The light was the color of skim milk, and the cold had settled so deep into the stones of the walls that her breath stood up in front of her face like the steam off a kettle. She had slept in her clothes on the bare wood of the loft floor, with her canvas bags for a pillow and her wool shawl pulled over her like a blanket. She had not made a fire. The chimney, she had decided in the lantern light the night before, was not to be trusted until it was inspected and the hearthstone was cracked clean across. And she had been too tired to do anything but climb the ladder, lie down, and let the long day fall off her shoulders into the dark. She lay for a long moment, looking up at the underside of the sod roof, where the dry brown grass made a coarse, upside-down meadow over her head. She listened. She heard the creek running. She heard a single jay screaming somewhere up in the pines. She heard very faintly the wooden popping of the timbers as the morning sun began to warm the south side of the cabin. She did not hear another human voice. She did not hear a wagon. She did not hear a clock ticking, or a stepmother sweeping a parlor, or the slow scratch of a pen in a ledger. She heard nothing at all that belonged to the life she had walked away from. She sat up slowly. She looked down through the open square in the loft floor at the room below. It was in the cold gray morning, a worse room than it had been in the swaying yellow lantern light. The dust was thicker than she had realized. A long string of cobwebs sagged from the rafters. The broken table lay on its side with one leg snapped off, and beside it, half buried in dust and leaves that had blown in through the broken window, was a child's small wooden top, painted once in red and yellow, the paint now faded to the color of old bone. She looked at the wooden top for a long time. She climbed down the ladder. She picked it up. She wiped it clean on the hem of her dress very gently, and she set it upright on the windowsill in the place where the morning light first touched the wood. Then she put on her work apron, and she rolled back her sleeves, and she began. For 9 days, Maren Whitfield did almost nothing but work. She worked from the first gray light of dawn until the last red light died behind the western ridge. She worked with a single-mindedness that had no anger in it and no grief in it, only the steady, patient, consuming attention of a person who has been given a thing that needs doing and intends to do it well. On the first day, she swept the cabin. She swept it 3 times. She swept out the dust and the dry leaves and the mouse droppings and the small white skeletons of 3 field mice that had died in the corners. She swept out a brown paper twist that had once held tobacco. She swept out a single dried wildflower, pressed flat into the dust, as though it had been left there by someone who had stopped to lay it down. On the second day, she walked the half-mile down to the creek bend where Silas Thornberry had told her the old Vance brothers before the war had quarried the slate for the roofs of Hollow Creek, and she gathered an apron full of small flat stones, and she carried them back and she set them aside for the patching of the hearth that she was not yet ready to begin. On the third day, she cut a long, straight branch of green willow and a thick bundle of dried meadow grass, and she climbed up onto the sod roof, and she patched the hole above the loft, weaving the willow and packing it with mud from the creek bank, the way Wendell Carver had taught her to patch a barn roof. And when she climbed down at dusk, her hands were caked to the wrists in cold red clay, and her shoulders ached. And she stood in the clearing and looked up at the chimney and the patched roof, and she said softly to the cabin, "That'll do." On the fourth day, she walked the mile down the creek to the settlement. Silas Thornberry was sweeping the porch of the store as she came across the wooden bridge. He stopped sweeping when he saw her. He leaned the broom against the porch rail. He waited for her at the top of the steps without speaking. "I've come to bring back your lantern," she said. "Keep it," he said, "until you have a lamp of your own." She nodded. She set the lantern carefully on the porch boards anyway. "I need nails," she said. 8 penny, 2 pounds, and a small pane of window glass if you have one no larger than 10 by 12, and a sack of cornmeal, and a 1/4 pound of salt pork if there's any to be had. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not ask where the money was going to come from. He went inside the store. He came back out with the nails wrapped in brown paper. The pane of glass laid carefully between 2 thin boards and tied with twine the cornmeal in a small cotton sack and the salt pork wrapped in waxed cloth. He set them all down on the porch boards beside the lantern. "That's $1.40, he said. "Settle when you can." "Mr. Thornberry," she said quietly. "Silas," he said. "Just Silas, child." "Silas," she said, "I have to ask you something." He waited. "The night I came in, she said you saw the knife on my hip and you went white as a sheet. And you said I had not come to this valley by accident. And then you walked me half a mile up the creek path in the dark, and you did not say one word more about it. I would like, if you are willing, to know what it was you saw." The old man looked down at the porch boards. He looked up at the high ridge above the valley where the sun was just beginning to clear the trees. He looked at her. "Child," he said, "there are some things a man has carried for a long time, and the way he carries them best is by not setting them down all at once. I will tell you what I saw in time. I will tell you what I know. But the cabin you have bought has more to say to you than I do, and what it has to say, it ought to say first. Find it. Find what it left for you. Then come and see me, and I will tell you everything." She studied his face. She nodded once. She gathered up her nails and her glass and her cornmeal and her salt pork and her lantern and she walked back up the creek path to the cabin without another word. She found it on the 7th day. She had spent the 5th and the 6th days on the broken hearthstone. The hearth was the great work and the dangerous work. The chimney itself, when she had crawled inside with a small lantern and run her hand up the inner wall, was sound. Samuel Ashford had built it true, and the mortar between the bricks was still tight 25 years later. But the hearthstone, the great single slab of pale gray granite that floored the firebox and ran out across the front, was cracked from corner to corner, and it had settled so unevenly into its bed of sand that the front edge was nearly an inch lower than the back, and any log that rolled forward off the andirons would roll right out onto the floor of the cabin and set the place ablaze. The stone had to come up. It was the most physical work she had ever done. She cut a long lever out of a straight young oak. She rounded a fulcrum stone from a chunk of slate. She wedged the lever under the front lip of the hearthstone. She set her shoulder to the lever and pushed. The stone groaned. It did not move. She pushed again. The lever bent. The stone shifted a 1/4 inch no more. She worked at it for 2 full days. She inched it up. She slid wooden wedges underneath. She rested. She lifted again. By the afternoon of the 6th day, the great slab was standing on its long edge, propped against the brick of the firebox, and the bed of sand and old gray ash beneath it was exposed to the cool autumn light for the first time in 12 years. On the morning of the 7th day, she knelt down beside the hearth with a small whisk broom she had made from a bundle of broom corn, and she began slowly and carefully to sweep out the bed of the hearth. The first thing she found under the ash was a child's marble blue glass with a swirl of white through its heart. She set it gently on the windowsill beside the wooden top. The second thing she found 3 inches below that was a small iron horseshoe nail, bent into a perfect circle of the kind that miners' wives sometimes made into wedding rings when there was no silver to be had. She set that on the windowsill too. The third thing she found in the very center of the hearth, where the heart of the fire would have burned for 10 years before the family broke apart, was the corner of a piece of oilcloth. She did not breathe. She brushed away the sand around it. It was a small bundle no larger than a loaf of bread wrapped in heavy black oilcloth and bound about with twine that had been waxed against rot. She lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it slowly across the cold room and set it down in the square of sunlight that lay across the broken table, and she took out the knife of Wendell Carver, and she cut the twine. She peeled back the layers of oilcloth. Inside, neatly stacked, were 9 $20 gold pieces. She had never in her life seen a $20 gold piece. She had seen a few silver dollars. She had seen once the gold pocket watch of the Cumberland Lumber Company's general manager, who had come down to Mill Hollow on an inspection and had pulled the watch from his vest pocket in the lobby of the bank. But the heavy yellow coins now lying in front of her Liberty, the woman's profile stamped on one side. $20, the eagle stamped on the other, were a sum of money so far beyond anything she had ever held that her mind, for a long moment, refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. $180. It was more money than her father, scratching at his ledger 15 hours a day, earned in a year. She set the coins to one side with hands that were not quite steady. Beneath the coins in the oilcloth lay two more things. The first was a small, smooth river stone, dark gray, the size of a hen's egg, polished to a soft shine by what looked like a great many small hands rubbing it for a great many years. The second was a folded letter, the paper yellowed at the edges, the folds soft with age, the wax seal broken once and pressed shut again. She picked up the stone first. She held it in her palm. It was cold and smooth, and it weighed almost nothing, and she understood before she even opened the letter that the stone had belonged to a child. A child had carried it in his pocket. A child had stood on the bank of the creek and chosen it out of 1,000 other stones because something about its smoothness or its shape or its color had told him that this stone and no other was his. She set the stone on the table beside the gold. She unfolded the letter. The handwriting was a woman's. Small, clear, beautifully formed, but trembling slightly toward the end of certain lines, as though the hand that wrote it had been very tired, or had been holding back something it did not wish the page to see. The letter was dated June the 17th, 1896. To whoever finds this beneath the hearthstone of the house I built with my husband. My name is Esther Ashford. If you are reading these words, it means I am gone from this valley, and either dead or so far away that my absence amounts to the same thing. I do not know who you are. I have never met you. I do not know if you are a young woman
or an old man, if you came to this cabin out of greed or out of need. If you found this letter by chance, or because some kindness in your nature led you to lift the broken stone of our heart and set it right, I hope only that you are a person who has known what it is to be alone in the world, because then perhaps you will understand what I am about to tell you.
My husband Nathaniel and I came up this valley in the spring of '83. We came with our hands and a wagon and $140. And we built this cabin together, stone by stone, log by log, through the spring and summer, and into the autumn of that year. Nathaniel was a stonemason. He had served in the war as a young man in the West Virginia Mounted Infantry, and he had come home with 2 friends from his regiment brothers in spirit, if not in blood. One of those friends helped him raise the ridge beam of this house in August of '83, and that man's mark is still cut into the underside of the beam where you may have seen it. Marin read that line 3 times. She looked up slowly at the great hewn ridge beam that ran the length of the cabin above her head. From where she sat at the table, she could just see in the angled morning light the small, clean, intertwined letters cut into its underside. a W, and a C. She put her hand flat against the table to steady herself. She read on. Our boy was born in this house in March of '85. We named him Ambrose after Nathaniel's father. He was the kind of child who is given to a man and a woman once in their lives and not always then. He had his father's dark eyes and a way of standing very still when something interested him. His small head tilted, listening to a thing the rest of us could not hear. He loved this creek more than any place on earth. His pockets were always full of stones. He had favorites. He had names for them. The dark gray stone you will find in this bundle was his most favorite. He called it his thinking stone because he said when he held it in his hand, he could think clearer. In the winter of 1892, a sickness came up the valley and our boy was taken. He was 7 years old. He died in the loft of this cabin in the bed his father had made for him on the third night of the new year. I will not tell you about that. I will only tell you that something in his father went out of the world with him and never came back. Nathaniel went on working at the Holloway silver mine on the high ridge because the mine paid in coin and the cabin had to be fed. He had been working that mine off and on for 5 years. He had come to know its veins as a man knows the rooms of his own house. And in the spring, after our boy died in the deep level of the mine where the older work had played out, my husband found a new vein. A great, rich vein of silver-bearing ore running through the wall of an old gallery that the Holloway Company had abandoned as worthless 3 years before. Nathaniel did not say a word to anyone in the mine. He came home. He told me. We sat at this table together and we wept because we understood that this discovery, if we could only protect it, was going to be enough to take us out of this valley, to take us somewhere far away, to take us perhaps to a place where the loft of this cabin would not be the first thing my eyes opened to every morning. Nathaniel went down to the county seat the following Monday. He filed a private claim on the abandoned gallery. The clerk did not understand what the claim was for. The Holloway Company did not know they had given up a fortune. My husband came home from the county seat that night, and he hid the receipt for the claim in a place I will tell you of in a moment. He kissed me at this table. He said, "We will go out of this valley before the snow flies, Esther. We will go where the sky is big." The next morning, he went up to the mine to give his notice. He did not come down. They told me when they brought his body home in a wagon at sundown that there had been a fall of rock in the deep level, that the timbers had given way without warning, that my husband had been the only man working in that gallery at the time, and that nothing could be done. The man who told me this, standing in my own doorway with his hat in his hands, was the mine foreman. His name was Bartholomew Holloway. He was the brother of the man who owned the mine. He stood in my doorway and he gave me his condolences in a low, quiet voice. And as he was turning to go, he said one more thing to me very softly almost as an afterthought. He said, "Mrs. Ashford, your husband mentioned to me last week that he was thinking of filing some kind of private claim." I told him I thought that was unwise given the company's interests in that section. "I would consider it a personal favor, Mrs. Ashford, if any papers of that nature were to find their way back to me. The company would, of course, see that you were generously compensated for any inconvenience." He smiled when he said this, and I knew in the way that the body knows a thing before the mind has put words to it, that the timbers in the deep gallery had not given way without warning. I knew that my husband had been killed for what he had found, and I knew that the man who stood in my doorway with his hat in his hands had given the order. I told him I knew of no such papers. He stood for a long moment looking at me. Then he tipped his hat, and he said he was very sorry for my loss, and he climbed up into his wagon, and he drove away down the creek path. I held on in this cabin for 3 years after that. I held on because Nathaniel was buried under the pines behind the house, and because Ambrose was buried beside him, and because I could not bring myself to leave them. I held on because to leave was to admit that the men who had taken everything from me had won. But in the spring of this year, 1896, Bartholomew Holloway began to come around. He came twice. Each time he was very polite. Each time he asked, in the kindest way, whether I had ever come across any papers of my husband's that might pertain to the mine. Each time, as he was leaving, he reminded me how isolated the cabin was, how a woman alone in such a place might come to harm in 100 ways that no one would ever see. The third time he came, I understood that he meant to kill me, and that the only thing keeping him from doing so was his belief that I might still lead him to what my husband had found. And so I am going to disappear. I am going to walk out of this valley with one small bag, and I am going to a place where the name Esther Ashford will not be spoken again. I do not know yet where. I only know that I cannot stay, and I cannot take with me what I am about to leave under this stone, because if I am caught with it on the road, I will be killed for it before nightfall. Beneath this letter, wrapped with the gold and the stone, you will find the receipt for the private claim my husband filed at the county seat in the spring of '93. It bears the seal of the county clerk and the signature of Nathaniel Ashford. It is by the laws of this state a valid and standing claim. Anyone who possesses this paper possesses, in the eyes of the law, the right to the deep gallery of the Holloway mine. The gold is the savings of our marriage. It was meant for our boy. We will not be needing it now. I leave this all to you, whoever you are. I ask only 3 things. First, if you find it in your heart, take the dark gray stone down to the creek some afternoon and let the water run over it once. Ambrose loved the sound of the water. I would have him hear it again, even if it is only through a stranger's hand. Second, if you have the strength and the courage that I did not take the claim that lies beneath this letter and use it to do what my husband died for. Open the gallery, take what is rightly his, and see that the name Holloway in this valley is brought to account for what was done in the spring of 1893. Third, do not be afraid. The men who took my family from me are the kind of men who win only because no one stands against them. If you have read this far, you are already standing. Esther Ashford, Hollow Creek, June the 17th, 1896. Marin laid the letter down on the table. She sat very still in the cold sunlight. She did not move for a long time. The cabin around her was the same cabin it had been when she had unfolded the oilcloth. The same dust hung in the same square of light. The same blue marble sat on the same windowsill beside the same painted top. The same dark ridge beam ran above her head with the same small intertwined letters cut into its underside. But the cabin was no longer a cabin she had bought. The cabin was a story she had been handed. She picked up the dark gray stone. She closed her fingers around it. It was the size of a child's hand. It fit her palm exactly. She held it for a long moment, and then she set it down very gently in the center of the table, beside the letter, beside the small heavy stack of gold coins, and beside one more thing that she had not at first noticed. Tucked into the very back of the oilcloth bundle, folded into a quarter, the size of the letter, was a separate single sheet of heavier paper embossed in the upper left corner, with the seal of the clerk of court of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and bearing in the center, in a clear official hand, the words, "Claim of private interest. Deep Gallery Holloway Mine. North. Working filed this 14th day of April, 1893. Nathaniel Ashford, claimant." She looked at it for a long time. She folded it very carefully. She slid it inside the front cover of her mother's worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress, which was the only thing she owned in the world that no one would ever think to search. She walked down to the creek that afternoon. She carried the dark gray stone in the hollow of her right hand. She walked the path slowly past the place where the cabin's small, dead garden lay buried under brown weeds, past the stand of ponderosa pine that gave the clearing its shelter from the north wind, down the soft, worn footpath that the boots of a young father and a small running boy had cut into the earth 20 years before her time. She knelt at the edge of the water. The creek was cold. She could feel it on the skin of her wrist before her hand was even in. She lowered the stone into the current. The water rushed over it clear and bright, the way the water had rushed over it 12 years before, when a small, dark-eyed boy had pulled it out of the stream bed and stood up wet to the knees and held it up to the sun and decided that this stone and no other was his. She held it there until the cold of the water had run all the way up her arm and into her shoulder. She lifted it out. She set it on a flat rock at the edge of the bank to dry, where the late afternoon sun came down between the pines. She did not weep. She said only very softly, "There, Ambrose, that's done." Then she walked back up the path to the cabin she had bought with $12, and now understood she would have to defend with her life. The next morning, Tabitha Doyle came up the creek path with a basket on her arm. Tabitha Doyle was the wife of the only farmer in the lower end of the valley, whose land ran all the way down to the bottom flats, where the creek widened out into the meadows. She was perhaps 42, with red-brown hair that she wore in a long braid down her back, and a face the wind and the sun had been working on for 20 years. She came up to the door of the cabin in a blue calico dress and a man's brown wool coat too large for her, and she stood at the open doorway and she looked Marin up and down once with a pair of very clear gray eyes, and she said, "I saw your smoke yesterday morning. I told my husband somebody is finally living in the Ashford place. I told him that somebody is going to need bread." She lifted the cloth off the basket. Inside was a loaf of brown bread, still warm, a small crock of butter, 6 brown eggs, and a jar of dark amber honey. Marin did not know what to say. Tabitha did not seem to require that she say anything. She set the basket on the broken table. She looked around the room slowly. She nodded once at the patched roof, once at the new pane of glass in the window, once at the great hearth, where the slab still stood on its edge against the brick. "You'll want help with that stone," she said. "I'll manage," Marin said. "I expect you will," said Tabitha Doyle, "and I expect you'll do it faster with 2 pairs of hands. Jedediah Marsh is coming up this afternoon. I told him to." Jedediah Marsh came up the path at 3 o'clock with a wooden tool chest balanced on his shoulder and a clay pipe clenched between his teeth. He was 67 years old, a square-built man of medium height, with iron gray hair cut short and a beard that came to a neat point and was nearly white. He wore a leather apron over a flannel shirt, and the apron was so old and so dark with mortar dust that the leather had gone the color of an oiled gunstock. He set the tool chest down on the porch boards. He took the pipe out of his mouth. He looked at Marin for a long, quiet moment, and he said, "You're Wendell Carver's girl." Marin did not answer. "Tabitha said you was," Jedediah said. "I didn't believe her. Now I do." How Marin said quietly, "Do you know that?" He smiled just barely at one corner of his mouth. "Child," he said, "I rode out of Lewisburg in May of '61 in a company of 58 men. 41 of us came home. Wendell Carver was the man who rode on my left for 4 years. Nathaniel Ashford was the man who rode on my right. I helped Nathaniel raise the ridge beam of this cabin in August of '83. I cut the chimney stones on the south side. I know every joint in this house, and I know," he said, looking at her very steadily, "the way a man teaches a young one to stand when she's holding a knife. You stand the way Wendell stood. You stand exactly the way he stood. He set his pipe back between his teeth. He picked up the tool chest. Now, he said, let's set that hearthstone. They worked for 3 days on the hearth. Jedediah Marsh did not waste motion, and he did not waste words. He showed her by doing how to lay out 3 smaller stones to replace the single broken slab. He showed her how to mix the lime mortar to the precise wet feel of a thick custard, the trowel coming up clean, but the line of mortar still glistening. He showed her how to tap each stone into its bed with the wooden end of a mason's mallet, listening for the moment the dull thud went solid. He showed her how to tool the joints clean with the edge of a pointing trowel and how to set the front edge of each stone exactly a hair higher than the back, so that any ember that rolled forward would roll into the firebox and not out onto the floor of the cabin. On the evening of the 3rd day, when the last stone was set and the lime was beginning to harden into the joints, he stood up slowly from his knees and put one broad hand flat on the new hearthstone and looked at her. That'll hold, he said, 100 years. She looked at him. Mr. Marsh. Jedediah. Jedediah. She paused. She chose her words slowly. You knew Nathaniel Ashford. You worked this mine. Do you believe the fall of rock in the spring of '93 was an accident? He looked at her for a long moment without answering. He took out his pipe. He tapped the bowl very gently against the new mortar of the hearth. He said, No, child. Do not. I have not believed it for 15 years, and neither has any man in this valley who worked that mine with Nathaniel Ashford. We have known all of us that Bartholomew Holloway killed that man. We have known it the way you know the weather. But knowing a thing and proving a thing are not the same thing, and Bartholomew Holloway has been dead now these 8 years, and his son Cyrus owns the mine, and Cyrus owns the sheriff, and the sheriff owns the judge, and the judge owns the jury. And so what is known in Hollow Creek has stayed in Hollow Creek, and the men who knew it grew old, and one by one they died, and the thing was never spoken of out loud. He paused. Until you came up that creek path, he said. I have proof, she said quietly. He looked at her. He waited. I have the claim, she said. The private claim Nathaniel filed at the county seat in April of '93. The one Bartholomew killed him for. I have it folded inside the cover of my mother's Bible upstairs. Esther Ashford left it under the hearthstone 12 years ago, in case someone came who would have the courage to use it. Jedediah Marsh set down his pipe very slowly on the new hearthstone. He sat down on the cold floor of the cabin with his back against the bricks of the firebox, like a man whose legs have suddenly decided they will no longer hold him. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Child, he said, do you understand what you are holding? I think I do. Cyrus Holloway. Jedediah said, We'll hear about you. He will hear about you within a week. He has a man at the land office in the county seat who reads every deed that gets recorded in 3 counties and sends a list to the big house in Lewisburg the 1st of every month. The deed to this cabin was recorded the day you signed it. By the 1st of November, Cyrus Holloway will know that a 19-year-old girl bought the Ashford place for $12. By the middle of November, he will come to see you. He will be polite. He will offer you 10 times what you paid. When you say no, he will offer you 50 times. When you say no again, he will stop being polite. He looked at her. You should leave that paper with me, he said. You should let me carry it down to Charleston on the next stage. There are men in Charleston who will know what to do with it. You should not be the one holding that paper when Cyrus Holloway comes up this creek path. Marin was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the new hearth. She looked at the small wooden top on the windowsill. She looked at the dark gray stone now sitting on the shelf above the hearth, where she had set it after the creek had run over it. Jedediah, she said, Esther Ashford left this for someone with the courage to stand, not for someone who would hand it off to be carried by another. I will go to Charleston myself in time, but not until I have looked Cyrus Holloway in the face on the porch of this cabin and let him see what kind of person bought it. Jedediah Marsh looked up at her from the floor. The corners of his eyes crinkled very slowly in a way that was not quite a smile. Wendell Carver, he said softly, taught you well. The first letter from Wendell Carver arrived 11 days later. It came down out of the mountains in the leather pouch of the postwriter who left it on the porch of Silas Thornberry's store. And Silas himself carried it up the creek path that evening and put it into Marin's hand. The envelope was addressed in a small, careful hand. The M in Marin drawn the same way it had been drawn on the scrap of brown paper her father had hidden in the canvas bag. But this was not her father's hand. This was a hand she had watched at work for 8 years on the back of a Windsor chair. She opened it at the table by the new hearth. Marin Silas wrote to me, I am glad you came through alive. I am glad the cabin still stands. I am glad you found what was hidden there, which I suspected was there, but did not myself ever look for, because it was not mine to look for. I will write more in time. I will come if you need me. Send word. Mind the south window. Esther always said the latch was weak. W.C. That was all. She read it 3 times. She folded it. She put it inside her mother's Bible beside the folded claim. That same evening, Silas Thornberry sat down with her at the new hearth, and he poured himself a small cup of the coffee she was now able, with one of Tabitha Doyle's gifts, to offer a guest. And he looked at her across the firelight, and he kept his promise. The knife on your hip, he said softly, was made by a man I have known since I was 19 years old. Wendell Carver and Nathaniel Ashford and I rode out of Lewisburg together in the spring of '61. 3 boys. We did not know each other then. We knew each other by the autumn of '65. We were as close to brothers as men can become who are not born to the same mother. Nathaniel came up this valley in '83 with his wife and his boy. Wendell helped him raise the cabin. So did I. The mark on the ridge beam, child, that's not Wendell's alone. He cut his maker's mark there because he was the master carpenter on the work. But Nathaniel laid the stone, and I laid the chimney, and Wendell raised the roof, and we three put our hands on every piece of this house that summer. When Nathaniel was killed in '93, Wendell came up. He stayed a week. He helped Esther dig her husband's grave under the pines behind the cabin. He helped her plant the marker. He told her on the night before he left that if ever she or any child of hers needed him, she had only to send word and he would come. Esther never sent word. Esther disappeared in '96, and Wendell, who had been writing her a letter every other month, stopped getting any answers. He never found out where she went. None of us did. But Wendell carried the promise. He carried it for 12 years. And when a small, lonely girl in a town 2 valleys east of here started standing at the door of his carpenter shop in the summer of 1900, child, Wendell saw what kind of girl she was. He did not know she would ever come to Hollow Creek. He had no reason to think she would. But he taught her the trade he had taught Nathaniel's brother in the war. He taught her stonework. He taught her to load a rifle. He gave her the knife he had been keeping for the daughter he never had. He taught her child because that was the kind of thing Wendell Carver did. He taught her because a man who has lost a son does not stop being a father. He only goes looking for someone to teach. And then one October morning, a girl walked into my store with $12 and that knife on her hip, and I saw the work of 40 years sitting on her belt, and I understood that the promise Wendell carried for Esther Ashford had finally, by some long, crooked road I do not pretend to understand, come up the creek path. That is what I saw, child. That is what I could not say out loud the night you came in. Silas Thornberry set down his cup. He looked at the new hearth. He looked at her. Cyrus Holloway is coming, child, he said quietly. Jedediah told me what you have. Word will reach the big house in Lewisburg before the month is out. When he comes, you will not be alone on this porch. I am telling you that now, so that when the day comes, you will not need to ask. She looked at him across the firelight. She nodded once. She did not trust herself just then to speak. Cyrus Holloway came up the creek path on a cold blue morning in the second week of November. He came in a polished black buggy drawn by 2 matched bay horses, with a driver in a stiff, dark coat sitting up on the box. The buggy pulled into the clearing in front of the cabin a little after 10 o'clock. The driver got down. He opened the door. A tall man in a long black greatcoat and a stovepipe hat stepped out. Cyrus Holloway was perhaps 45 years old. He had a clean-shaven face, the color of wax, a thin, straight mouth, and pale blue eyes set very wide apart under a high white forehead. He wore a heavy gold watch chain across the front of his black waistcoat and a single thick gold ring on the smallest finger of his left hand. He carried in his right hand a black leather portfolio with brass corners. He walked across the clearing, slowly looking at the patched roof, at the new glass in the window, at the smoke rising in a thin, straight column from the chimney. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. Marin was sitting on the porch in a wooden chair Jedediah Marsh had repaired for her. The carving knife of Wendell Carver lay across her lap in its sheath. She was sewing a button onto a flour sack shirt. She did not stand up. She did not stop sewing. "Miss Whitfield," Cyrus Holloway said. His voice was soft, educated, and not unpleasant. "Mr. Holloway," she said. He smiled very slightly. "You know my name." "I know your name," she said. He stood for a long, quiet moment at the foot of the steps. The cold blue light of the November morning falling across his pale face, and he looked at her with the polite, measuring attention of a man assessing the value of a horse he intends to buy. Then he said very gently, "Miss Whitfield, I have come to make you a generous offer." She tied off her thread. She set the shirt down on the porch boards beside her chair. She lifted her eyes to his. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you may make your offer. I will hear it once, and then you will get back into your buggy and you will drive down out of this valley, and you will not come up this creek path again." The thin, straight mouth of Cyrus Holloway did not quite stop smiling, but the pale blue eyes very slowly went cold. And high up on the ridge above the cabin, in a stand of yellow birch where the trail came down from the upper trace, Jedediah Marsh lowered his old field glasses and put his hand quietly on the stock of the long Sharps rifle that lay across his knees. Cyrus Holloway opened the brass clasp of his leather portfolio with the slow, practiced motion of a man who had opened it 1,000 times before in 100 parlors and kitchens and front porches across 3 counties, and had almost always closed it again with the signed paper inside. He drew out a single folded document. He held it lightly between 2 pale fingers. "Miss Whitfield," he said in his soft, educated voice, "I have here a bill of sale prepared by my attorneys in Lewisburg for the property on which you are presently sitting. The sum offered is $600 in gold payable to you on the day you affix your signature. I will be honest with you. The cabin and the 5 acres are not worth $600. They are worth perhaps $80. The remainder is what we shall call the inconvenience fee. The inconvenience of asking a young woman of 19 who has just begun to feel at home to gather her things and find another place to live before the snow." He extended the paper. He did not climb the porch steps. He held the paper out toward her at the level of his own shoulder, as a man holds out a piece of bread to a strange dog. Marin did not reach for it. She did not look at the paper at all. She looked at his face. "Mr. Holloway," she said quietly, "what is it about 5 acres of stone and rotted log that brings a man with 2 matched bays and a polished buggy a day's ride out of Lewisburg in November?" The thin, straight mouth smiled very slightly. "Sentiment, Miss Whitfield," he said. My father had a long connection with the man who built this cabin. He felt before his own passing that the property ought to belong to our family. I am in my middle years, attending to the unfinished business of a father I greatly admired. Your father, Marin said, had Nathaniel Ashford killed in the spring of '93 for the sake of a vein of silver. Nathaniel had filed a private claim on at the county seat in Greenbrier. That is what I would call the unfinished business of your father. Cyrus Holloway's hand holding the bill of sale did not move, but the air on the porch changed. It changed the way the air changes in late summer, when the wind drops away to nothing in the half hour before a storm. The driver in the dark coat, standing beside the buggy, took 1/2 step away from the horses without quite seeming to know that he had done it. Cyrus Holloway looked up at Marin with his pale blue eyes set wide apart under his high white forehead, and for a long moment he did not speak. Then he lowered the paper slowly and slid it back into the leather portfolio and closed the brass clasp. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and the softness was still in the voice, but something underneath the softness had come up close to the surface. "I do not know who has been speaking to you, and I do not know what has been put into your young head. But I would urge you with the greatest possible kindness to consider your situation. You are a girl. You are alone. You are 19 years old, and you are living a mile up a creek path in a cabin no one in this valley would set foot in for 10 years. The roads in and out of Hollow Creek in winter are difficult. The post comes once a week. The nearest doctor is 27 miles. Accidents, he said, are common in country of this kind. They are particularly common in my experience among young women who have come into possession of properties they are not equipped to defend. Marin stood up slowly from her chair. She set the shirt with the half-sewn button down on the porch boards. She did not draw the knife from her hip. She walked in 3 unhurried steps to the head of the porch stairs, and she stopped there, and she looked down at him from the height of the porch boards. She was a small woman. He was a tall man. But she stood on the porch, and he stood on the cold, packed earth at the foot of the steps, and for that one moment, she was the taller of the two. "Mr. Holloway," she said, and her voice was as quiet and as even as her mother's had been on the worst nights of the worst labors. "The document your father wanted from Esther Ashford 12 years ago, the document he killed her husband to get and could never find, is no longer under the hearthstone of this cabin. It is in the hands of a man you have never met in a town you have never been to. And if I do not send him a particular letter by a particular post on the first day of each month, that document will travel to the office of the Attorney General of the state of West Virginia in Charleston, together with a sworn affidavit signed and witnessed, setting forth the manner in which it came to be where it is." This was not true. The document was at that moment folded inside the front cover of her mother's Pilgrim's Progress, sitting on the shelf beside the dark gray river stone 6 feet behind her left shoulder. But Cyrus Holloway did not know that. She watched his face while she said it. She watched the muscle along the line of his jaw harden very slightly, and watched the pale blue eyes flick once almost imperceptibly toward the buggy and the driver and the empty creek path behind him. The way the eyes of a man flick when he is for the first time in many years doing arithmetic, he did not expect to have to do. "That is a very serious claim, Miss Whitfield," he said softly. "It is a true claim, Mr. Holloway." "You are bluffing," possibly she said. "You may take the chance if you like." He stood for a long moment at the foot of her porch steps. A jay called somewhere up in the pines above the clearing. The cold wind moved through the dead grass at the edge of the path. High on the ridge above the cabin, in the stand of yellow birch, where the upper trace came down, Jedediah Marsh sighted very carefully along the long blue barrel of the Sharp's rifle, and he settled the bead onto the breast pocket of the long black greatcoat, exactly where the heavy gold watch chain crossed the wool, and he did not move. Cyrus Holloway tipped his stovepipe hat very slightly toward Marin. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I have enjoyed our conversation. I will think over what you have said. I will in the fullness of time return." He turned. He walked across the cold-packed earth of the clearing to his buggy. The driver opened the door for him. He climbed in. The driver climbed up onto the box. The driver gathered the reins. The two matched bays turned the buggy in a wide, slow circle in the clearing, and the buggy rolled down the creek path toward the settlement, and the cold blue light of the November morning closed in around the place where it had stood. Marin did not sit down again until the sound of the wheels was gone. When she finally sat down, her hands were shaking so badly that she could not have threaded the needle to finish the button on the flour sack shirt. She held them tightly together in her lap, and she made them be still, and after a long while, they were still. He came for the cabin 12 nights later. He did not come himself. He sent 3 men with torches. The night was the cold, clear black of late November, with a sliver of waning moon riding low over the western ridge, and the stars burning hard and bright in the gap above the pines. Marin had gone up to the loft after supper to mend a tear in the elbow of her wool dress. The fire on the new hearth had burned down to a deep red glow. She heard the first horse just as she was tying off her thread. She did not move at first. A horse on the creek path at that hour was not in itself an impossible thing. It might be a traveler. It might be Silas Thornberry bringing a letter. It might be Tabitha Doyle's husband come up to ask the loan of a tool. Then she heard the second horse, then the third. Then she heard the soft, rough whisper of a man's voice, low and careful. The voice of a man giving an order he does not want to carry on the night air. She set down the dress. She blew out the small tin lamp on the floor beside her. She slid the carving knife of Wendell Carver from its sheath at her hip, and she laid it on the boards in front of her, and she crawled across the loft to the small, dark square of the loft window that looked out over the clearing. She lifted the corner of the cotton curtain. 3 men were dismounting in the clearing. 2 of them were strangers, big-shouldered men in dark coats, with bandanas pulled up across the lower halves of their faces. The third was a small, thin man Marin had seen once before, a week ago, drinking coffee on the porch of Silas Thornberry's store. She had not known his name then. She knew now from the way the 2 bigger men were looking at him for instruction that he was the one who had been sent in charge. Each of the 3 men carried in his right hand a long pine torch wrapped at the head with oiled cloth. The small, thin man struck a sulfur match against the leg of his trousers. He lit his torch first. Then he lit the torches of the other 2 men, one after the other, the oiled cloth catching with a soft, hungry whump, the yellow light leaping up and throwing the 3 faces into sharp moving shadow against the pale, dead grass of the clearing. The small, thin man turned toward the cabin. He took 1 step. The flat, dry crack of a heavy rifle rang out from the high stand of yellow birch on the ridge above the cabin. The torch in the small, thin man's hand spun once in the air and fell to the cold, packed earth 6 feet away from him, where it lay sputtering and hissing and beginning to set the dry grass alight. The small, thin man stood very still for the space of half a heartbeat, looking down at his empty hand as though he could not understand what had happened to the thing that had just been in it. The second crack of the rifle came a heartbeat later. The bigger of the 2 strangers in dark coats went down. He went down sideways slowly, the way a man goes down who has been hit very hard in the upper part of the chest, his torch falling away from him into the grass, and his bandana sliding loose from his face as he hit the ground. The third man dropped his torch and ran. He ran across the clearing toward his horse, the second stranger close behind him, and the small, thin man last of the 3 scrambling backward over the dead grass, and then turning and running too, his hand pressed against the front of his coat, where the splinters of the shattered torch had cut him. Marin came down the ladder. She came down with the knife in her hand. She did not light the lamp. She crossed the room in the red glow of the fire, and she pulled open the heavy plank door, and she stepped out onto the porch. She did not need to do anything. It was already done. The 2 surviving men were already on their horses, already wheeling them in tight, panicked circles in the clearing, already kicking them hard down the creek path toward the settlement. The horse of the man who had been hit stood for a long moment over its fallen rider. Then it too turned and bolted after the others, and the sound of 3 sets of hooves on the cold ground rolled away down the valley and was gone. The dropped torches were burning the dry grass. The bigger man in the dark coat lay on his back in the clearing very still. A figure was coming down the ridge from the stand of yellow birch. It was Jedediah Marsh. He had the Sharp's rifle slanted across his chest, the long blue barrel still faintly smoking in the cold. Behind him, coming down the same trace at a slower pace, with a coal oil lantern in his hand, was Silas Thornberry. behind Silas coming up the creek path from the settlement at a half run, his nightshirt tucked hastily into his trousers, was Tabitha Doyle's husband Owen, with a long-handled shovel in his hand for the burning grass. Maren did not move from the porch. She stood barefoot in the cold and the red firelight, the knife of Wendell Carver in her right hand. And she watched the men of Hollow Creek come down the ridge and up the path and into the clearing to put out the burning grass and see to the man who would never again sit on the porch of Silas Thornberry's store and drink a cup of coffee. Jedediah stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked up at her. He did not say anything. He nodded once slowly. Maren nodded back. The sheriff of Greenbrier County came up the creek path on horseback at noon the following day. His name was Garrett Hollis. He was a tall, thin man of 50, with a gray mustache and a long face the wind had cracked across the cheekbones. He was, by everyone's account, the man Cyrus Holloway had owned for 15 years. But the man who had been killed in the clearing was, as it turned out, not a man any sheriff could quietly forget. He was an out-of-state hand hired up from a railroad camp in eastern Kentucky 3 weeks before, with no people in West Virginia at all, and with a body that now lay covered with a wagon tarp on the cold ground in front of the cabin, and that the sheriff was going to have to write a report on. Sheriff Hollis got down off his horse very slowly. He looked at the burned patch of grass in the clearing. He looked at the body under the wagon tarp. He looked at Jedediah Marsh and at Silas Thornberry and at Owen Doyle, who were standing on the porch with Maren in the middle of them. He took off his hat. He turned the brim of it slowly between his thumb and his finger. "Boys," he said, "I am going to have to ask the 4 of you to tell me what happened up here last night." Silas Thornberry spoke first. Silas Thornberry was 65 years old, and he was not the man he had been 40 years before in the West Virginia Mounted Infantry. But on that cold November morning, with his white hair smooth against his long, narrow skull, and the small, old, puckered scar on the back of his left hand catching the noon light, he was as close to that younger man as he had been in 3 decades, Garrett Silas said quietly. 3 men came up the creek path last night to set fire to this cabin. They were carrying lit torches. One of them is the dead man under that tarp. I will swear to that under any oath you care to put me under. And so will Jedediah, and so will Owen, and so will Miss Whitfield. The 2 other men rode south out of this valley at a hard gallop. You will find them, I expect, sitting at the long table in the kitchen of Cyrus Holloway's house in Lewisburg. Garrett Hollis did not look at him. Garrett Hollis was looking at Maren. He looked at her for a long, careful moment, and he saw a small, dark-haired young woman of 19 standing on the porch of a stone cabin a mile up a creek in a clean brown dress with a patched elbow, with a leather sheath on her hip, and a man like Jedediah Marsh on her right hand, and a man like Silas Thornberry on her left. And he saw behind her in the open doorway the warm red glow of a fire on a new hearth. The sheriff was not in the end a stupid man. He had owned his soul to Cyrus Holloway for 15 years. But Cyrus Holloway Sheriff Hollis was beginning to suspect was no longer the man it was safe to owe one's soul to. He cleared his throat. He put his hat back on his head. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "do you have anything in your possession that you believe might be relevant to a charge of arson or attempted murder, or to any other matter pertaining to the late Bartholomew Holloway, or to his son Cyrus Holloway?" Marin walked back into the cabin. She came out a moment later with her mother's Pilgrim's Progress in her hand. She opened the front cover. She drew out 2 folded papers. The first was the embossed receipt of the Clerk of Court of Greenbrier County, West Virginia, bearing the date of April the 14th, 1893, and the signature of Nathaniel Ashford, claimant. The second was the letter of Esther Ashford, dated June the 17th, 1896. She held them out to Sheriff Hollis. "Sheriff," she said, "these are the only 2 pieces of paper in this valley that have ever told the truth about the death of Nathaniel Ashford. I am putting them into your hand. I expect you to put them before sundown tomorrow into the hand of a judge in Charleston who does not owe Cyrus Holloway anything. If you do not, I have a friend who will. Either way, Sheriff, these papers will reach Charleston this week. I would prefer they reach Charleston by way of you." Sheriff Hollis took the papers. He held them for a long moment without unfolding them. He looked at her face. He looked at Silas Thornberry. He looked at Jedediah Marsh. He looked back at her. "Miss Whitfield," he said slowly, "I have been the sheriff of this county for 11 years. In all that time, the only thing I have ever been ashamed of in this office is what I have not done." He folded the papers carefully and put them inside the breast of his coat. "I would be obliged," he said, "if you would allow me to do it now." He rode back down the creek path 20 minutes later with the wagon tarp folded across the back of his saddle and the dead man tied across his second horse, and he did not stop in Hollow Creek when he reached the settlement. He kept riding south, and he reached Lewisburg at dusk, and he did not go to the big house on the hill where the heavy gold watch chain hung on a stand beside a polished walnut bed. He went to the courthouse, and he sat down at the small desk in the back office where the night clerk kept the late ledger, and he wrote out a sworn statement in his own careful hand for 3 hours by the light of a tin lamp. And at first light, the next morning, he put the statement and the 2 folded papers from Marin's mother's Bible into a locked leather pouch and tied the pouch to the saddle of his fastest horse. And he sent a young deputy he trusted, who had never met Cyrus Holloway in his life, riding hard west along the New River for Charleston. The young deputy reached Charleston in 3 days. The story broke in the newspapers in Charleston in the first week of December. By the second week of December, the story was in the newspapers in Wheeling and in Cumberland and in Pittsburgh and in Richmond. By the third week of December, the federal marshals had arrived in Lewisburg, and Cyrus Holloway had been arrested in the front parlor of his own house in front of his wife and his 2 grown daughters on a charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the 2nd degree. and the silver mine on the high ridge above Hollow Creek had been placed by order of the Circuit Court under the temporary trusteeship of the state of West Virginia. Wendell Carver came up the creek path on the 18th of December. He had ridden the night train from Mill Hollow to White Sulphur Springs on the 17th, and he had paid a young teamster with a wagon $1 to carry him as far up the valley road as the wagon would go. And then he had walked the last 6 miles in the cold with a small leather satchel in one hand and a long ash-handled axe in the other, because Wendell Carver did not travel anywhere without a tool. The afternoon was very cold and very clear. A thin skin of snow lay over the brown grass of the clearing. The smoke rose straight up out of the chimney into a sky the color of a bluebird's wing. Marin was out behind the cabin splitting kindling when she heard the soft step on the path. She set down the hatchet. She walked around the side of the cabin to the front clearing. A small old man in a long black wool coat was standing at the foot of the porch steps. He had set down his satchel on the porch boards. The axe was in his left hand. The 70-year-old face of Wendell Carver was as weathered and as still as it had always been. The gray eyes as quiet as they had always been. The broad, gnarled hands. The same hands that had set the small block of pine and the small knife on the stump 8 summers before. But there was something around his eyes that Marin had never seen in 8 years of standing in his shop, and it took her a long moment to understand what it was. It was that his eyes were wet. She stopped at the corner of the cabin. She did not move. For a long moment, they only looked at each other across the cold, clear December air. Then Wendell Carver set down the axe. He climbed the 3 porch steps with the slow, careful weight of a man whose knees were no longer young, and he crossed the porch in 3 slow, careful strides, and he put his broad, gnarled hands on her shoulders, and he pulled her into him, and he held her the way a man holds his own child, the way he had not held any living person in 22 years, the way a man holds the thing he was beginning to fear in the long dark of his own old age. He was no longer going to live long enough to hold. He held her for a long time. When at last he stepped back, his hands did not let go of her shoulders. "Child," he said very softly. She did not trust her voice. She only nodded. He looked past her at the patched roof, at the new pane of glass, at the smoke standing up straight out of the chimney into the clean blue cold of the December sky. "You held this place," he said. "With help," she said. "With your own 2 hands and a borrowed rifle," he said. "I have read every word in the Charleston papers. Silas wrote me 3 letters in 12 days. I know what you did, child." He paused. He looked back at her. His hands were still on her shoulders. "And now," he said, "I am going to tell you what I should have told you 8 years ago." They sat at the new hearth that evening. Wendell Carver sat on the small three-legged stool Marin had built. Marin sat on the new wooden bench Jedediah Marsh had helped her cut out of the long boards of a fallen white oak. Between them, the fire burned low and steady on the new hearthstone, and the dark gray river stone of the dead boy, Ambrose, sat on the shelf above the firebox, in the place where she had set it back in October, and the cabin was warm and very quiet. Wendell Carver looked into the fire for a long moment. Nathaniel Ashford, he said, was the man who rode on my right hand for 4 years in the war. We were 19 years old when we rode out of Louisburg in May of '61. We came home 4 years later, and we were not 19 years old anymore. He went down to Greenbrier, and I went home to Mill Hollow, and we wrote each other letters for the next 20 years. In 1883, he sent me a letter that said he had bought 5 acres up a creek nobody could find on a map, and he was going to build a cabin there for his wife and his boy. And would I come up and help him raise the ridge beam? I came up. So did Silas. So did Jedediah, who had settled down here after the war. The 4 of us raised this house in the summer of '83, and I cut my mark in the underside of the ridge beam on a hot afternoon in August. And Nathaniel laughed at me, and Esther brought us cold buttermilk in a stone jar, and the boy, Ambrose, who was not yet born, would later, when he was old enough to climb a ladder point, up at that mark and ask his father what it meant. Nathaniel told him, "Child, that mark means a man named Wendell, who is my brother in everything but blood, helped me build this house, and if you ever need a friend who will not fail you, you go and find that man." Wendell paused. He drew a slow breath. Ambrose died in the winter of '92, he said. Nathaniel died in the spring of '93. I came up here within the week. I helped Esther dig her husband's grave under the pines. I sat with her at this very hearth, child, on the night before I rode home, and she told me, in this room by this fire, that she believed her husband had been killed for what he had found in the mine. I asked her what proof she had. She told me about the claim. She told me she had hidden it under the hearthstone with the savings they had put by for the boy. I told her that night, sitting where you are sitting, that if ever she needed me, I would come. I told her that if she could not stand against Bartholomew Holloway alone, she had only to send word, and I would stand with her. She nodded. She did not promise. And 3 years later, she walked out of this cabin in the early morning and was never seen again in this valley. And the letter I had been writing her every other month for those 3 years came back to me in the autumn of '96, marked at the post office in Charleston with the words, "Not found." He stopped. He looked at the fire. He looked back at Marin. I carried that promised child, he said. I carried it for 12 years. I did not know what to do with it. I had no son left in the world to teach. I had no daughter ever in the world to teach. I had nothing to do with a promise like that except to lay it down in the bottom of my chest and learn to live around it. And then one summer evening in the year 1900, a small, thin, lonely little girl from the White House at the edge of Mill Hollow came and stood at the open door of my carpenter shop, child, and she watched me work for 1 full hour without making a sound. And I looked at her, and I saw the loneliness on her, the same loneliness Esther Ashford had on her the night Nathaniel did not come down out of the mine. And I thought to myself, Wendell Carver, you have been given a thing to do. I did not know I was teaching you for this house, child. I did not know I was teaching you for this valley. I taught you because a man with no one left to teach is a man without anything left at all. I taught you because you had small, steady hands and a quiet way of standing, and I have always loved those things in a person. I taught you for 8 years because the teaching was the only thing in those 8 years that gave my own days any shape. But I will tell you now, he said what I have known in the back of my mind for at least the last 3 of those years. I will tell you what I knew on the night your father, on his way home from a sales call at the lumber yard, stopped in my shop to thank me for the chair I had made for his wife, and looked at you for a long time across the bench, and then said to me on his way out that he was afraid for you, Wendell, because his second wife did not love you, and he was no longer sure he had the strength to protect you. I knew that night, Wendell said softly, that the day was going to come when a road was going to open up for you out of that white house. And I did not yet know what road, and I did not yet know where it would lead. But I knew there was an old debt in me, child, an old promise to a dead friend's wife in a valley 100 miles west of Mill Hollow, and I began to wonder on that night whether the road that opened up for you was the same road I had been waiting 12 years to walk. He paused. He smiled very slightly in the way she had only ever seen him smile twice before in 8 years. Your father is not a strong man, Marin, he said, but he is not in the place he buries deepest a wicked one either. On the night your stepmother put you out, he did the one brave thing in his life. He put my knife in your bag. He wrote 2 words on a scrap of paper. He sent you to me, child, by way of a valley he had never seen. Because Caleb Whitfield knew the way men sometimes know things, they have never been told that the man who taught his daughter to cut a dovetail had brothers in a place called Hollow Creek. Marin did not speak. She could not. She sat on the new wooden bench, and she looked at the fire and the small hot tears that had not come on the morning her father did not turn from the window, and had not come on the cold paths with the placer miner, and had not come on the porch in front of Cyrus Holloway, came at last in the warm red firelight of her own cabin in front of the man who had taught her to hold a knife. Wendell Carver let her cry. He did not move from the stool. He only watched her with the broad, gnarled hands of an old carpenter resting quietly on his knees, the way a man watches the long, slow setting of a sun. He has been waiting all day to see go down. Esther Ashford came home in February. She was 58 years old. She had spent the last 12 years in the small mill town of Petersburg, Virginia, where she had taken a position as the schoolmistress of the local Methodist school under the name Esther Vance, which had been her maiden name, and where she had taught 2 generations of mill children to read and to sum and to write in a clear, careful hand. She had read the story of the trial in a Richmond newspaper a kind neighbor had brought her at the end of January. She had sat for 3 days at the small kitchen table of the room she rented above a milliner's shop on Sycamore Street, with her hands folded in front of her and the newspaper unfolded in front of her hands. And she had decided at the end of the 3rd day that the time had come to go home. She came up the creek path on a cold, bright afternoon in a long gray traveling coat with a small carpet bag in her hand. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. She stood for a long moment and looked at the cabin she had built with her husband Nathaniel in the summer of 1883. The cabin she had walked out of in the autumn of 1896 and had never expected to see again. The smoke stood up straight out of the chimney into the cold blue sky. A small piece of red calico curtain showed at the window. She set down her carpet bag in the snow at the edge of the clearing. She put one hand up to her mouth. She stood that way for a long time. Marin saw her from the porch. She did not call out. She walked down the porch steps in her wool dress and her shawl, and she crossed the cold-packed snow of the clearing, and she stopped in front of the small woman in the long gray coat, and the 2 of them looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. Esther Ashford had a face that had been beautiful once and was now something quieter and harder, and in some ways more beautiful than beauty had ever been. Her hair was almost entirely white. Her eyes were very dark and very steady, and they had been crying very recently, and they were not crying now. She reached out one gloved hand slowly, and she laid it against Marin's cheek. "Child," Esther Ashford said softly, "you did the thing I could not do." Marin did not answer. She only took the older woman's hand from her cheek, and she held it for a moment in both of her own, and then she turned, still holding the hand, and she led Esther Ashford up the porch steps and across the threshold and into the warm red firelight of the cabin Esther had built half a lifetime before. Esther stopped just inside the door. She looked very slowly at the new hearth, at the new bench, at the small blue marble, and the small wooden top on the windowsill, where Marin had set them on her first morning in the house. She looked at the dark gray river stone of her son Ambrose sitting in its place on the mantel shelf above the firebox. She walked to the mantel. She picked up the stone. She held it for a long moment in the palm of her gloved hand. She closed her fingers around it. She did not speak. She did not weep either. She had done all of that alone in a rented room on Sycamore Street in Petersburg, Virginia, 3 weeks before. She set the stone gently back on the mantel. She turned to Marin. "Tell me," she said, "who has helped you." Marin told her. She told her about Silas Thornberry, who had recognized the knife of Wendell Carver across his store counter on the night Marin came in out of the rain. She told her about Tabitha Doyle, who had appeared on the porch one morning in October with a basket of bread and honey and no questions. She told her about Jedediah Marsh, who had laid 3 new stones in the hearth and had stood with a Sharp's rifle on the ridge above the cabin on the night the 3 men came with torches. She told her about Sheriff Garrett Hollis, who had carried 2 folded papers in the breast pocket of his coat to Charleston in December, and had not, in the end, been the man Cyrus Holloway had thought he had owned. She told her last of all about Wendell Carver, who had come up the creek path 2 months before, with a satchel in one hand and an axe in the other, and who was at that moment 2 miles up the valley with Jedediah Marsh looking over the timbering of a small stone barn the 2 of them had decided to put up together in the spring. Esther listened. She did not interrupt. When Marin had finished, Esther sat for a long moment looking into the fire. "Marin Whitfield," she said at last, "I want you to keep this house. I want you to have it free and clear in your own name until you yourself decide what is to be done with it. I want the silver from the deep gallery of the Holloway mine when the state finishes its accounting and the courts release the funds to be divided in 3 ways. 1/3 to Wendell Carver, who carried a promise for 12 years and gave it at last to a small, thin, lonely little girl in a carpenter shop. 1/3 to be used to build a school in this valley, a free school for any child who wishes to come, and that school shall bear the name of my son Ambrose, who loved this creek more than any place on earth, and who never lived to see the inside of any school anywhere. And 1/3, she said, looking at Marin, to you, child, to do with as your own judgment shall direct. Marin shook her head slowly. "Mrs. Ashford, I cannot take 1/3 of your husband's silver." "You can," Esther said, "and you will. Because you woke this house up, child. You woke it up after 12 years of sleeping, and what you woke, child, you have a right to." Marin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I will take enough to set up a small carpenter shop in this valley. Enough for a workbench. Enough for a good set of tools. Enough that any woman or any man or any child in Hollow Creek who needs a chair built or a coffin made or a door frame set straight can come to me, and I can do the work, and they can pay me what the work is worth and not a penny more. The rest, Mrs. Ashford, I would ask you to put toward the school." Esther Ashford looked at her for a long time. Then the small, straight mouth of the older woman moved very slightly into the first quiet smile it had worn in 12 years. "Wendell Carver," she said, "taught you well, child." Caleb Whitfield came up the creek path on a wet morning in late March, when the snow was going off the south slopes and the creek was running high and brown with the melt. He came on foot. He came alone. He came with one small canvas bag over his shoulder, of the same kind he had once set on the porch of his white house at the edge of Mill Hollow on a cold October morning. And he came in a black coat that had been brushed and pressed, but was very plainly the same black coat he had been wearing for 10 years. He stopped at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin for a long time. The smoke was rising from the chimney. A line of clean wash hung out for the morning sun snapped softly in the cold breeze. A small new chicken coop had appeared at the south side of the cabin. A neat half cord of split kindling was stacked under the porch eave. Caleb Whitfield set down his bag in the wet brown grass at the edge of the clearing. He took off his hat. He stood that way, hat in his hand, for a long time. Marin came out onto the porch. She did not come down the steps. She stood on the porch boards in her wool dress, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smear of fresh sawdust on the front of her work apron, because she had been planing boards for a new door for Tabitha Doyle's spring house. And she looked across the clearing at her father, and her father looked across the clearing at her. Neither of them spoke. After a long moment, Caleb Whitfield said in a voice not much above the sound of the creek, "I have left her, Marin." Marin did not move. "Prudence," he said. "Her brother, the house, the whole of it. The Reverend has been quietly removed from his pulpit by the bishop. There is to be a public examination of the church accounts in April. Your land on Sutton Ridge, child, is being restored to your name by the order of the same circuit judge in Charleston who sat on the Holloway case. The papers will be in your hand by Easter." He paused. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I do not have the right to ask. I am asking," he said, "only whether there is a thing on this property that needs mending that a man with a hammer in his hand could see to before nightfall." Marin looked at her father. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a smaller man than she had remembered. The hair at his temples was almost entirely gray. There was a long, thin line at the corner of his mouth that had not been there in October, and his shoulders inside the black coat were thinner than they had been, and the hand that held the hat was trembling very slightly with the cold. She did not come down the porch steps. She did not open her arms. She said quietly, "The front gate on the path down by the creek crossing is hanging crooked. The hinge is cracked. I have new strap iron in the lean-to. If you have your hammer, I will lay you out the work." Caleb Whitfield nodded once. He bent down. He picked up his bag. He walked across the wet brown grass of the clearing toward the porch. They worked on the gate together all that afternoon in the cold March sun. They did not talk much. He held the post steady while she heated the strap iron in a small forge of stacked stones she had set up at the lean-to. She tapped the new hinge into shape on a flat piece of granite she had laid across two split logs. He drove the carriage bolts when she had drilled the holes. The work took until the sun was almost behind the western ridge. When the last bolt was set and the gate swung true and silent on its new hinge, he stepped back and looked at it, and he did not say anything. She stepped back too. After a long moment, he said very softly, "Your mother, child, would have been very proud." She did not answer. She did not need to. She handed him the hammer to carry back up the path, and she carried the small forge stones in a leather bag over her shoulder. and the two of them walked up the creek path together in the long red light, the way she had imagined 10,000 times in the long evenings of her childhood, that she and her father might one day walk somewhere together. The first winter ended. The second winter came. In the cabin on the night of the first heavy snow of that second winter, there were 7 people gathered at the new hearth Jedediah Marsh had laid in November of 1908. Marin sat on the wooden bench at the side of the fire, with a small notebook open on her knee, in which she had begun that autumn to keep careful drawings of every chair and every table and every door frame she had built in her first full year as a working carpenter in Hollow Creek. Wendell Carver sat on his stool across the fire from her, mending the leather binding of his own old folding rule with a small awl. Esther Ashford, who had taken a small house in the settlement and had agreed, at the request of Tabitha Doyle and 7 other mothers, to become the first teacher of the new free school that was to open its doors in May, sat in the cabin's only proper armchair, reading aloud from a small cloth-bound volume of poems. Silas Thornberry and Jedediah Marsh sat side by side on a long pine bench Marin had built that summer, smoking their pipes in companionable silence. Tabitha Doyle stood at the table behind them, slicing a loaf of warm bread for supper. In the smallest chair, drawn up close to the fire so that the heat could reach his hands, sat Caleb Whitfield. He had been living since the previous June in a small room above Silas Thornberry's store. He had taken the position of bookkeeper for the new school. He came up the creek path once a week on Sunday afternoons, and he and his daughter would walk the property together for an hour without speaking much, and then he would help her with whatever needed doing, and then he would walk back down the path before dark. He did not, on those Sunday afternoons, ever ask her to forgive him. She had not in any words ever told him she did. But on this particular night, the night of the first heavy snow of the second winter, he had stayed for supper, and now he sat in the smallest chair beside the fire, with his hands held out to the warmth, and Marin, looking up from her notebook, found that she could look at him without anything moving in her chest that did not belong there. That was all. It was enough. On the shelf above the new hearthstone, in the place where the firelight reached them most warmly, sat 2 objects side by side. The first was the carving knife of Wendell Carver in its leather sheath. The blade of fine Swedish steel that had cut its first dovetail in a carpenter shop in Mill Hollow on a wet March afternoon when Marin was 11 years old. The handle of polished applewood that had ridden on her hip for 4 days through the cold Appalachian foothills in October, and had been drawn once by a stream against a placer miner, and had been laid across her lap on the porch the morning a tall man in a long black greatcoat had stepped down out of a polished black buggy. The knife of the teacher who had given her her first true gift, and who had given her at last the second gift of his own long-kept story. The second was the dark gray river stone of Ambrose Ashford. The stone a small boy had pulled from the creek in the summer of 1891 and had carried in his pocket for 18 months and had laid down at last on the dresser beside his bed on a winter night in 1892. The stone his mother had wrapped in oilcloth 4 years later beneath a stack of 9 gold coins and a folded letter, and had hidden under the broken hearthstone of an abandoned house in the dim hope that someone would one day come who would lift the stone and read the letter and bring all of it back into the light. In the spring of that second year, when the new school had been raised and the silver of the deep gallery had begun to flow back into the small, careful hands of the people it had been stolen from, Marin Whitfield took down from the mantel a small square of fresh black oilcloth and a length of waxed twine and a folded letter she had spent 3 nights writing in her clear, careful hand. She walked out to the new hearth. She knelt down. She loosened with a small pointing trowel the frontmost of the 3 stones Jedediah Marsh had set in November of 1908. She lifted it gently aside. Beneath it, in the bed of clean sand, she laid a small bundle. Inside the bundle were 3 things. The first was a single $20 gold piece of the kind Esther Ashford had left for her under the same stones 12 years earlier, set aside now for whoever might one day need it. The second was a small, smooth river stone she had taken from the creek bend the previous October. On the afternoon, she had walked the dark gray stone of Ambrose down to the water and let the current run over it one more time. The third was the letter. The letter began, "To whoever finds this beneath the hearthstone of the house I have lived in. My name is Marin Whitfield. If you are reading these words, it means I am gone from this valley and either dead or so far away that my absence amounts to the same thing. I do not know who you are. I have never met you. I do not know if you are a young woman or an old man. I know only that you have lifted the stone of this hearth, and that the lifting of stones is a thing only certain kinds of people ever bother to do." This house was built in 1883 by a man named Nathaniel Ashford and a woman named Esther, with the help of 3 friends who had ridden out of Louisburg together in the spring of 1861. It held a great happiness for 10 years and a great grief for 3 years more, and then it stood empty for 12, and then in the autumn of 1908, a young woman with $12 in her pocket bought it from the county for the price of the deed and learned by lifting these same stones that it had been waiting for her all along. If this house has been waiting for you, friend, you will know it by now. The smoke will be going straight up the chimney as you read this. The wind will not be coming through the south window. Some person you did not yet know last week will have brought you bread this morning. These are the signs. Take the gold. Take the stone. Take the letter. Build what wants to be built. Mend what asks to be mended. Do not be afraid of the men who think themselves above the law. They are smaller in the end than the smallest stone of any honest hearth. And do not at any cost let this house be a place of sorrow. Let it be a place of new beginnings. Marin Whitfield, Hollow Creek, April the 3rd, 1910. She folded the letter. She wrapped the bundle in the fresh oilcloth. She tied it with the waxed twine. She laid it down in the clean bed of sand beneath the place where the heart of the fire would burn for the next 100 years. And she set the new stone back into its place. And she pressed a fresh joint of lime mortar around the edges with the steady, patient hand of a person who had been taught by a master of his craft how a thing was meant to be done. She stood up. She brushed the white mortar dust from her work apron. She looked for a long moment at the new hearth. She looked at the knife of Wendell Carver and at the dark gray river stone of Ambrose Ashford side by side on the mantel above. She looked at the small new window in the south wall, the latch fixed now and proof against the wind. She looked at the world her $12 had bought her. She walked across the room. She lifted the latch of the heavy plank door, which hung straight and true now, on its 3 new strap-iron hinges, and she stepped out onto the porch of the cabin in the bright spring sunlight. And she went down the steps to begin the work that was waiting for her in the long green valley of Hollow Creek.